initiative, what started as an anonymous effort to raise money for PRUMC, a teen who actually needed mental health treatment, became God knocking on a very persistent nudge to develop a mental wellness ministry here at the church in a place of faith at PRUMC. The mission of the One Lamb Initiative is to nurture, embrace mental wellness in a faithful community that supports education, connection, and of course support. The vision of One Lamb is for every faith place worldwide to establish a mental wellness ministry, and they're working to establish more One Lamb chapters within the community. So far they've offered almost 70 programs with about 2,500 participants over 2.5 years. There's a dynamic volunteer team that takes their passions for a particular mental health issue or age group and develops programming just like this event to chip away at the stigma, learn the science, seek spiritual connections, and provide an environment of support. So today's event that you're here for was birthed from a discussion of older PRUMC parents wishing that when they were at probably your age and stage of parenting, they were given more tools in raising their children. So we have an excellent qualified panel that's going to talk with us a little bit about it. I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. Our agenda this morning is there are some questions that I will ask the panelists, and then at the end there will be plenty of time for you guys to ask questions too. We're going to be covering depression and anxiety, social media, social aggression and isolation, learning differences in early intervention, disordered eating and self-harm, and finally, when family systems break down. So I will let our panelists, starting with Morgan, introduce yourselves, and then we'll get started.
Good morning. Is that working? Okay. I'm Morgan DiOrio. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and I have a private practice here in Atlanta going on 11 years now. I also have a little bit of background as a school counselor at Marist in Westminster, and I work with individuals and families and love supporting parents as they support their kids, so I'm excited to be here.
Good morning. I'm Kelli Bynum, and I'm a licensed psychologist. Been in practice about 30 years this year. I also serve as the director of counseling at Mount Vernon School, and I've been there, lost track, 13 and 14 years, somewhere around there. So I predominantly see adolescents in my practice and young adults, but obviously a lot of family work. Anytime you work with adolescents, you're getting the whole system. And then I spend a great deal of time managing my own 3 children and a really sassy Labrador Retriever.
Hi, I'm Andrea DeWalt. I'm a licensed psychologist also, and my practice is on the other side of the courtyard. I have been in practice for also close to 30 years. Kelli and I are in the same cohort. And I am seeing families. I also see adults, marriage and family systems, but I do a lot of work also in the school system, where I work with doing a lot of educational evaluations for learning disabilities, autism, and so forth. And I don't know that I so much manage my 3. Mine are now young adults, sort of, and I have a very sassy dog as well.
I'm Jan Street, and I have been at the Schenck School /Read Source, which is our sister organization, for 23 years. So I wish that meant I was younger than them, but it actually means it was a second career for me. And I got there by way of my own children being dyslexic, and so I have lived the experience on both sides. And I think I'm also here because we lost a child to cancer, so I know a little bit about that kind of trauma. So anyway, I don't know what else to tell you about me, but I'm the director of teacher training, so I get to train teachers to help kids learn how to read, which is amazing. I love it.
All right, well, we're going to start just with an overview of what is depression and anxiety in young kids. And the way that this will work is I will ask a question to one of our panelists. They'll give an explanation, but as we discuss, y'all can piggyback, and if you have something to add, that would be great. So we're going to start with Morgan, and the first question is, tell us a little bit about what's the definition, what is anxiety and depression in kids?
Sure. So Anxiety and depression both affect how we think, how we feel, and how we act. There is a genetic or family history component to both. They can be influenced by major life changes or events or our environment. Both have both physical and psychological symptoms. I think depression is, it's feelings of sadness or an individual's loss of interest in activities that used to be enjoyable for them. When I talk about anxiety, I like to kind of compare it to stress because I think that anxiety gets thrown around so much as, oh, I'm so anxious, but stress and anxiety have similar symptoms, but they're actually very different. Stress is based off of external factors. So I've got a test coming up this Friday that I'm really nervous about. Stress can be motivating, so it means that we care about something if we're stressed out. It can also be helpful for us in terms of safety, so making us aware of potential threats, problems, obstacles to overcome. Anxiety is different in that it is internal, so those feelings of distress are not alleviated, so it's not necessarily based off of what's going on out in our world, it's inside of us. And it's often focused on the past, so ruminating or thinking about a past event, like I can't believe I said that, all of the coulda, woulda, shouldas, or future oriented, so thinking about all of the unknowns, all of the what if this happens, what if this doesn't happen. And anxiety and depression, they both, if the symptoms are really bad, then that starts to change our behaviors, which prohibits us from kind of showing up in our life activities.
Great. Piggybacking on that, for the audience and for families and parents, how would they know if their child is anxious or depressed? What are the signs, the symptoms? And then the second part of that is, what do you do?
So great question. And symptoms are varied and look different in different individuals. Kids are not very good at verbalizing what's going on, so you really want to pay attention to behavior changes. And what to look out for, we all feel worried at various times in our lives. We all feel sad at various times in our lives. So you really want to pay attention to the duration that you're noticing things. So have you observed an ongoing shift in your child's behavior that is preventing them from engaging in social relationships and their relationships with their family, in school or extracurricular activities? For example, with depression, symptoms have to be present every day, almost all day long for at least 2 weeks. And so, I always tell parents, you know your child best. So if you're worried about something or if you notice something that seems like a drastic ongoing change that is impacting your child, definitely reach out and seek additional support. We take our kids to the doctor for physical ailments, so why not get some support with mental health as well? You could verify your concerns with the pediatrician or partner with your child's school counselor and see if the school or teachers are noticing the same things that you're noticing at home. I think we're going to talk a lot about communication with your kids today, and if you're kind of looking to do some things to support your children at home, communication is a big piece of this. You want to set the stage for your kids to feel comfortable coming and talking to you about their concerns throughout their life. So if your child says something to you, I'm worried about this or that, instead of saying, oh, you shouldn't be thinking about that, or don't worry about that, it will be okay, really lean into those conversations with them and explore, what that means for them. And again, they aren't the best verbal communicators all the time, but if you're having those conversations early, and if you're modeling for them kind of how you handle stressful situations or times where you felt down, that's going to help them to develop positive coping strategies. I also tell parents to be careful, like kids are little sponges, so don't let your stuff, like your stress and anxiety, trickle down to them.
I have one
again, because you know your children the best, you are also in the perfect position to teach them. So if you see them sort of really not handling a situation well, that's a time to jump in and give them some examples of what they could do differently. So.
Right. So thank you for that. We're going to go into some different areas that we might see mental health or depression or anxiety manifested. The first one, and I know this is a big thing for me, I have a teenager, a 16-year-old. He's basically like 5, but he is 16. And so the social issues, whether it be in technology and social media or the things that they experience at school, are very present. Not just preschoolers that I work with, there's social stuff there, but it continues as they get older. So we're going to focus a little bit on social media. And the first question is, when should we even let our kids have social media in this day and age?
I know all of y'all are out there going, never. So this is such a hot topic that, y'all, I brought cheat sheet notes because, and even this morning I was adding more things that were just going through my head because I thought there's just so much. You can spend an hour talking about this one and really not get 10 panelists to agree on anything, but I will. Okay, so here's the thing. I think there's a lot of important pieces. Social media is not going away, so the answer is not never give it to them. The answer is just to equip yourselves as parents and to communicate with your child, right? So I would say, if you look at the research that just keeps popping up, as parents, you have resources like Common Sense Media, and Child Mind Institute has fabulous articles that are easily accessible to read. Common Sense Media has a lot of parent platforms, but in general, if you look at the Surgeon General's report that just came out this year around isolation and depression, and you look at the top researchers around adolescent development and the brain, they are recommending that, at least in terms of social media, not before age 13, and for some apps, closer to 16. Again, those are totally personal decisions. Based on research, and some of the brain research looks at things like addiction. The algorithms that social media uses can actually enhance the behavior of coming back to it because the algorithm, which I'm not good at explaining algorithms, but basically they'll continue to throw out content, and it may, in cases of kids who are kind of already anxious and depressed, increase their anxiety and depression, right? So I know at this point I've totally sold you all, don't go anywhere near social media. That is really not the case, okay? So I do think there are benefits to that in terms of some social connection. For some kids, it's a good way to learn problem solving or to be validated, to find communities where they can connect on certain things when they maybe have some trouble doing that. But I'm going to bring you back to a couple things that I think are really important. Using some sort of family tech planner or teaching, and in that, and you can actually get one. Common Sense Media links you right to one that you can tailor to yourself or to your family's needs. But teaching your kids, what does acceptable use look like in your family? What are your rules going to be? Because again, and I think all of us will reiterate this, you got to get comfortable saying no. You got to get comfortable saying, I only want you on it an hour a day or 2 hours a day. What we know from the research is that most teens are anywhere from 4 to 6 plus hours a day. Some of that's complicated by schools that use computers, so you have to separate out, the computer used for schoolwork versus just kind of that scrolling behavior. So that's a big piece, but really looking at what do those hours look like? Where am I going to let them use this? How are we going to turn it off? And how are we going to talk about it? And the one key thing, we talked about this the other night, is if you start to see a mood shift, even just they're on playing something, and shut it down, because obviously they're just in a space where they need to be pulled off of it.
Well, and this wasn't part of our preset questions, but as a parent, one of the things I think we're also wondering is, how do we monitor that, right? So how much independence do you give your child versus how much are you involved? Are you friends of theirs? Are you on Snapchat? Are you on TikTok watching them? Where do they get to be them in that world, and how much are you involved?
There's two different ways. I told my kids as soon as they got stuff that I was going to be following their sites and seeing their behavior. Now, the tricky piece is a lot of them will set up a separate account.
That's what I was going to
name, and you don't find it, right? However,
like reading your kid's diary, are you supposed to do that?
Yeah. Right, and that is hard because you're not necessarily building trust. So again, that's a communication issue with the kid. You do want to look, if you know that your child is already very impulsive, that may definitely determine how and what you give them access to. What you might say is, I'm not going to follow you because that might be embarrassing, but I want your passwords so that I can occasionally take a look. You also want to just encourage them to talk to you about it because at no point in time is it a rosy ride for everybody, right? At some point, kids are going to have some glitches and be upset, and you want to have positioned yourself to be the person that they come to and talk to about that because they are going to have mixed feelings. What you need to be careful of is that you don't just join in that conversation on the end because they'll switch back to wanting to do it. It's what their friends are doing. It's how they feel connected in strange ways. Everything in life is a balance, so encouraging them to also engage without. So sometimes you might have your kids have friends over and you say, you know what, we're eating dinner together and nobody's looking at their phones right now. And they might initially all give you a dirty look and then actually 5-10 minutes in, they're making eye contact and speaking. So it is important to just give both of those. And in terms of do you want to read the diary or not? It's a village, and if your friends see something or hear something, and something's going on in your child's account, that's a perfect opportunity to have a conversation with them. But I think it's really important to just say, can you let me have access so we can talk about this together? Mm-hmm. And then make sure that you as a parent have gone through digital citizenship with them. How do you communicate? What are the things you don't share? What are the things you do share? What would that look like? Even sharing something that you've seen some of your friends do to kind of give them an idea of this is not okay to share or that's okay.
Yeah, and it's just so interesting with social media because I think also as parents we have to educate ourselves on what these platforms do. So, you've got 16, 17-year-old kids who are following each other on Snapchat and you see, oh, my friend is at the coffee shop, so she must be with Milan and Milan is with McKenna and I'm not included. And I think that is a good transition into our next topic, which is isolation and social aggression, not to use the word bullying or anything, cliche, but Andrea is going to talk to us a little bit about the impacts of social aggression and isolation on mental health. Okay, so my first question, let me ask you a question. What is a good way to handle it when your child comes home saying that they don't have any friends and nobody wants to be their friend?
We all go through this. You've probably all heard something like this, and it probably depends on their developmental stage. What I would say is your number one job, I think as a parent, is to learn how to empower your children. The last thing you want to do is jump right in and try to solve all their problems. I know you'll hear this when they go to school, if they forget their homework, let them, deal with that. It's kind of the same thing. We don't really work on that social piece. We don't emphasize. We look at cognitive, we look at academic skills, we push for all that, but sometimes we forget that social skills are also skills that we have to learn and grow and build. And so if they're in preschool, we want to empower them with language like, I don't like that, and no, and appropriate ways to kind of assert themselves. As they get older, we can start to partner with them. We don't have to jump right in and solve the problem. We can talk through some of these issues with our kids and let them create some of their possible solutions themselves. I think it is the hardest thing as a parent to watch your child hurt and to watch your child feel excluded, and social media has only ramped that up as they get older. For our younger kids, it's not always a social media issue, it's just that they heard about a birthday party and they weren't invited. And, our quick fix, is to try to make them feel better, but a better way to handle that is to help them learn how to pivot. And I think that is really where we want, if they're in school and nobody wants to be their friend, I think learning to teach them how to pivot in that moment,
Kelly doesn't want to talk to me. Kelly isn't, being nice to me right now doesn't mean that I don't have to vilify Kelly either. And that's what I think as parents we do too. We want to jump in and say, well, Kelly's not. Instead, teaching them to pivot. And, if she's not going to talk to me right now, maybe I can make friends with Janet. Maybe somebody else will be my friend. and teaching them that there's another way to handle this, because you never know. Tomorrow, Kelly's my best buddy again. And so we don't want to jump in as parents either and get too involved in this whole dynamic. We want to teach them, what do you think you could do to solve the problem? When they come up with outlandish things, we can reel them back in and talk about, well, what would the consequences be of that action? But what else could we do? What else could we do? And helping them learn that, I can solve this when this comes up again. That's probably the best thing you can do to keep them from being victims or having that victim mentality. We don't ever want to try to get into this space where, they're less than. We're teaching them to flex those social muscles, those social skills. We're teaching them to develop that. It's complex, because friendships do come and go. They do wax and wane. They do that throughout our whole lives. And people have reasons that have nothing to do with us for not including us sometimes, or not making us part of something. Or maybe, what I will say is, if you're hearing this consistently though, and you see some indications that maybe your child is not ever being invited, or being kind of the child that nobody wants to, that might be a good time to start paying attention to, maybe there are some things I need to listen to. When you're talking to your preschool teachers, when you're talking to your school counselor, there sometimes are things that maybe we could help your child with, that if we're open and honest about it, they're not as successful doing right now. And so being willing to hear that maybe they're not the best friend, or maybe they don't have those skills yet, and being open to that will be helpful as well.
And just to piggyback on that, one question is, what if you start to suspect that your child is the one that might be the aggressor, or leaving people out, or, saying the not so nice things? Like, what if you start to suspect your child's the mean girl? That's hard too.
It is really hard, and I think nobody wants to admit, and I think specifically for girls, they're really complex interactions that particularly girls learn from very, very early on, and they try things out, and you feel powerful, and it's not always with an intent because you're an evil person or a bad person, but we hurt, and we go through that whole thing, and we often experience that as well. And so if you suspect that your child is being less than kind, I think those are just great opportunities for learning, and if it's a one-off or it's an event, it's a great opportunity to learn empathy and compassion, and really understanding, how do you think that made the other person feel? Sometimes it's shocking because they haven't stopped to think about it.
And it's power, right? Like, how much power do you have in a relationship, and how it makes you feel?
Well, sometimes they haven't. It's just like anything else we learn to do. Sometimes, especially the younger we are, we don't always think about the consequences of our actions. And so it's really about teaching them, what are the possible consequences of this? If you keep this up, and if you alienate, what are the possible consequences of that? And helping flesh that out for them sometimes is enough to understand that that's not quite the way I want to be. It is not that.
Well, two thoughts. You said one of them. So empathy at both ends. So the empathy, sometimes if your child is saying, this person's not being nice to me, obviously you want to validate their feelings first. And then, you want to ask them some things like, maybe something's going on with that person. Sometimes I've had friends that just act mean to me on a particular day because they're really sad about something. So, especially starting at a young age, teaching kids to identify the other person's feelings, their perspective, exactly. And then, to the second part of that, if your kiddo is the one being mean, where's that stemming from? So that's a whole nother line of opportunity for questions that you can have with your kiddo, because it's coming from somewhere. It didn't just drop out of the sky. So it's a matter of just trying to dig around. And I say that with caution. Like, our tendency as parents is to try, obviously, to fix, because we hate to see our kids hurting, but also to get in there and start asking. If they push back and don't want to have the conversation in that moment, let it be, move on, come back to it when they give you another window. Don't just kind of keep harping, because what you may do is just, build a bigger.
Along with that, when you are having these conversations, I always tell parents, make sure you're doing it at a time where emotions are not heightened, right? You don't want to have those conversations in the heat of the moment. You want to wait until your child is regulated and when you are no longer upset, so that you're really able to hear one another and actually communicate. Because, all of us probably know whenever you're talking to somebody who is angry, or when you're angry, or when you're feeling withdrawn because you're feeling attacked, not a whole lot's going to get through. So I think that those communication skills are so important to model with your kids as well. And having those conversations and helping coach them through that. Resiliency is a huge buzzword right now, but they have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And some of these social situations are really, really challenging, but having them be able to kind of work through it and bounce what they want to do to handle it off of you and get your perspective, especially when asked for, that's always the best way. Kind of help them to develop some of these skills, because kids are very egocentric. They're black and white thinkers. They're really focused on themselves and how they're feeling in this moment, and then have trouble, kind of thinking outside of themselves and how are other people perceiving this situation. So what Kelly was saying, it's like, what's going on with the other person that might make them be doing these things. So it's not about you all the time.
All right, well, we have about 3 more topics to get through, so I'm gonna make the transition, and with that, it's one of the things that we even say at preschool is learning most often happens when we're in disequilibrium, not equilibrium, right? Like, when everything's going great and life is good, but when we are pushed, even as adults, like right before the top of that frustration level, that's when we see change. So, with that, Janet's gonna talk a little bit about learning differences in early intervention. So, first question, what are some of the red flags that parents and teachers would be looking for when it comes to learning differences and, as that relates to the anxiety that can come from that?
Okay, I have a handout of red flags. Yay. These are actually red flags for dyslexia, because that really is my specialty. But the good news is dyslexia is the most common learning difference. And there are many others that go with it, such as ADHD, et cetera, et cetera. There's a researcher out of Yale, Sally Shaywitz. She wrote an amazing book. It's in its 2nd edition. It's called Overcoming Dyslexia. And she has done a 40-year longitudinal study. Now, if you know anything about research, there aren't that many 40-year longitudinal studies. She still has 82% of those kindergartners who are now 45, and she has determined, she just did a regular population, out of Connecticut, 20%, 1 in 5 are dyslexic. So this is a really much more common phenomenon. Here's the good news, it's totally overcomable. And the assessment of it is done by a clinical psychologist, but the remediation of it is done by an educator, an informed educator. So, obviously, I'm going to tell you the Schenck School is amazing, but there are other schools too. Y'all were so blessed in Atlanta to have the Speech School and Grace Point and the Swiss School and many others. So, it's very overcomable. While I have the microphone, this is a very dangerous thing, by the way. I did want to just comment on a couple of things. I have a master's in counseling as well, and one of the things that shocked me was when they showed us a video about teen suicide. Now, this is a number of years ago, but I'm fairly sure it's still true. They said, which parenting style do you think contributes most to teen suicide? Do you think it's the authoritative parent, or do you think it's the permissive parent? And of course, everybody said, oh, that mean authoritative parent. No, it's the permissive parent. You should feel confident saying no. And here's why. If I hover over you and I solve everything for you, what I don't realize as a parent is I am telling you, you can't handle this. Okay? You don't want to give your kids that message. So instead of telling them how to handle it, because you don't know, honestly, you don't know, you're not in fourth grade, you know? So, and fourth grade's changed, by the way, since we were there. So ask them. I mean, channel your inner psychologist and say, oh my gosh, that sounds like it hurt your feelings. Yes, it hurt my feelings. Wow, what did you do about it? Well, here's what I did. Oh, how did that work out? Oh, well, here's what I'm going to do next time. Oh, interesting. What do you think is going to happen then? You know, they're not stupid. Empower them. Okay, so that's my first thing. And then
One of the things, just to piggyback on that, is separate yourself. Oh, I was just like that when I was growing up. You know, like we hear that a lot even in prison. Oh, that's just like my husband. Oh, they had ADHD, so it's fine. Like really allowing them to be who they are and not putting that label on them because it was about you too.
I think talking about the technology, I love the suggestion of having a technology basket in your bedroom, and everybody, parents, kids, friends, when it's time to go to bed, we all put our technology in that basket and it all goes off, charges or whatever else, you know, because that way we're not touching it. They're not tempted to do it in the middle of the night, and your teens are doing it in the middle of the night. They're not getting good sleep. Another one on that is modeling. If you're constantly at the dinner table doing this with your phone head down, I mean, how many times do you go to the restaurant and the entire family is on their phone? It's such a miss. You're not being together. You're not playing hangman with the napkin. You're not playing tic-tac-toe. Okay, enough about that. All right, so I want to go back real quick to learning differences. And if I think everybody here would agree, if your mama gut or your daddy gut is telling you something's not right, probably something's not right, and it doesn't even matter what the topic is. But listen to your teachers. Be in partnership. They never see your child when your child puts his head or her head on the pillow and starts crying. They never see that. Okay, but here's what you don't see. You don't see your child trying to sit still in a classroom with their peers and learn something that's difficult for them. So they're seeing a side of your child that you never get to see, and you know, vice versa. So you've got to be a team. I know for my own children, I think I mentioned both mine were dyslexic. Well, my father was dyslexic, and he was an amazing medical doctor, chief of anesthesia at his hospital. My brother was dyslexic, he's a lawyer. I'm like, okay, you people are making a lot more money than I am, so what's wrong with this situation here? So I went into it not being afraid of dyslexia, and sure enough, the first conference, the first day I dropped him off at kindergarten, I said, hey, there's a lot of dyslexia in my family, let me know if you see anything. First conference, they're like, let's chat. So I was so fortunate, and my kids were so fortunate that they got tested in kindergarten. They learned to read in first and second grade at the Schenck school when everybody else was learning to read. And then they went back to love it and never missed a beat. So it's so overcomable, especially if you catch it early. What you don't want to do is wait till sixth grade, which is what I taught most of the time I was in the classroom, and they're already pretty traumatized.
And the difference of what they know and what you know they know, but how they demonstrate that knowledge, right? Like that's what school's about. Like, you know, we in parent conferences can say like, you know, this is what we see and this is where we have areas of opportunity for growth. And a parent will say, oh, I know they know that. Well, that's great, but school is about demonstrating that knowledge so that, you know, the curriculum becomes more compounding as they pillar. So we want the foundation there, which is where reading is so critical. And if you've never taught a child to read, just don't. Like, it's that hard. It's really hard. Let the teachers do it. It's pretty hard.
I have one comment too. As educators, we often make the mistake of assuming so many things in the classroom look the same. So we might assume that there's an attention issue or an anxiety issue when there is a learning struggle. And so I think that is where Janet was alluding to. It is really important to partner with your teachers and ask them what they're seeing. Or if you have the benefit of a friend, I hit up Janet on the tennis court and was like, hey, I'm seeing X, Y, and Z. And she's like, yeah, I can tell you. So, but it's really important to not make assumptions about what we think is going on without getting all that information from the educators, because there are a lot of undiagnosed learning struggles and challenges that could have been remediated at a younger age. And the remediation is somewhat easier and more outlined at younger ages.
Okay, I want to get to a really important part of this with Janet because we have a couple more topics, but one of the things that we get asked all the time is we're in a community, in a world of over-assessment, right? Like we constantly have to find out what's the answer. And in the world in which I work with early learning, we are looking at developmental milestones hit. And there's a certain time period that we allow a child to hit those milestones. But once we get out of that time period, early intervention, you've heard that word, we move in and we get information. And so when it looks at, the question is, when is the right time to get educational testing done? Part of that is, are we worried about development or are we worried about learning differences? So question for you is, when is the right time and age to start getting that educational testing done?
Again, speaking to dyslexia, which is the most common one, kindergarten, honestly. You know, we're lucky in this town that we have a lot of really good psychologists, but at first grade, I would say, you know, if you can, it's stupidly expensive, I'm sorry for that, but don't go cheap on it because you really want a good assessment. I will say from my own experience, you know, I brought my child to this psychologist. She spent 2 mornings with the child. She came back with this report, and I was dumbfounded that I said, how could you capture my daughter in such a short period of time? You nailed it. I mean, she knew everything, described her to a T. So you really, these are tried and true instruments that they're using, and they're very effective. So be open to listening to it.
Right. And to the point about educational testing being so expensive, there is an alternative pathway, which is the Individualized Education Plan IEP process through the public schools, which actually begins at 3 years old. So if the cost of it is a challenge, I mean, that's a whole nother topic that we could speak on about getting your child extra services. And I don't know if there's public teachers in the room, but I think dyslexia is now part of the eligibility factor. Is that? It didn't used to be.
I did add on the bottom of this a website, which is the Georgia Department of Education website. They have really focused on dyslexia, and there are all these new laws. It is now mandatory, starting in 2024, for dyslexia screening to be done at kindergarten, 1st, and 2nd grade. Now,
and do you know if there's an eligibility for special education?
Yeah.
There's not.
Well,
there didn't used to be. I just don't know if there is any.
There is.
There is no.
Well, in some states it is separate. In some states, in Georgia right now, the category of learning disability is 1. If a parent comes in with an eligibility or with a report saying their child or diagnosis with dyslexia, that child would still be served under that eligibility criteria, but that criteria may be separated. That's still in.
And sometimes if you're at a public school, there's alternative pathways through the response to intervention, the RTA process with, it's called EIP. There's progress monitoring, and sometimes just based on the progress, you can sometimes get some of those pull-outs and special accommodations as well. Okay, moving on, there's lots that we could talk about with that. We have 2 more topics, disordered eating and self-harm. Kelly's going to talk about that. And I think the first question is, you know, when does this begin? And what does disordered eating and self-harm look like with younger children?
Yeah, again, these are topics that you could spend a lot of time on each one. I want to start with the we've mentioned this a couple times, but I think it's important to mention again. Distress tolerance, or learning to tolerate distress or things that are frustrating, is really important. If you start to notice with your child that they are struggling in that area, that's a perfect opportunity to kind of help role model, help teach them. And so what happens with both the self-harm, which can go into various categories. We refer to it in the clinical world as non-suicidal self-injury. Non-suicidal self-injury doesn't necessarily mean that a child is suicidal. However, if the patterns of behavior of self-harm go on for extended periods of time, you do run a higher risk in terms of the research with a child also contemplating thoughts of really taking their life. So it is important to monitor it. And it looks different at different ages. However, the most common form of self-harm is still cutting. And Kids do it in various places. The most common area is the wrist, but they often do it in places that you don't see. So when I am talking to a parent about the fact that the child has revealed that, you know, they say, I had no idea, I don't see anything. It's not on the wrist or the ankles, which are common areas. And that's because the child is hiding it. So number one red flag for you at that point should be, there's a lot of shame around this. They're hiding it, they're afraid, they don't want to talk about it. But what they're trying to do is establish some control in their life where things feel out of control. I mean, other forms of self-harm that are seen, head banging, hair pulling, are other common ones, hitting yourself with another object. Those are all things that are seen in young children. And honestly, again, can run the gamut of what's going on. Sometimes kids who are struggling with a learning difference start some self-harm or start, again, to find some control in their life in another area. They might do that through restricting food. They might do that from eating food and getting rid of food, which are two common areas with disordered eating that you see. But again, trying to understand the whole picture of what's going on, because you might have some social aggression happening in their life. It might be something that's happening online. It might be happening face-to-face in their school. But kids feel out of control, their emotions feel out of control, and they look for things that, while they seem very irrational to all of us who aren't in that place, they're stuck in a place of, this feels like the only way I can get out of that. And also, oddly, our brain does some things like release endorphins around times of trauma and injury. So, ironically, and I know all of you have gone through this, kids will say, I felt better after I injured. And you're like, that can't make sense at all. But again, physiologically, it may make sense to them.
Okay. There may be some questions in the audience, and we'll come back to that, but I want to move on so that we have plenty of time for your questions at the end. Tough topic. Again, whole panel on this. Andrea is going to talk about when our family systems break down. Grief, loss, divorce. There's so much out there in the world, but our families is what supports our kids, and what happens when that happens. So, Andrea, what are good ways to support our child after an unexpected or anticipated family loss?
I think this kind of goes back to what we've all been talking about, which is empowerment and just listening, good communication, and just being there for them. I mean, there's no way to fix that for them sometimes. You know, there is no way to swoop in and just make it all different, or you know, there's no magic wand to go back in time. And so it does come down to distress tolerance and being able to teach them that this is how life works, which is a really hard lesson when you're a child, that there are things out of our control. Nobody wants that. We want things to go as anticipated, as expected. I think what we need to think about as adults is that, you know, we really just need to be good listeners. We need to acknowledge that this is a hard time, this is a difficult thing. If we know the loss is going to be like an anticipated loss, like an upcoming divorce, or somebody's dying, and we can help prep them a little bit ahead of time. You know, being on the same page is, even if parents are divorcing, but being on the same page and how we're going to co-parent, kind of getting the idea of what it's going to look like for the child. Children just really kind of want to know how it's going to affect them and what life looks like. I mean, not out of selfishness, it's just where they are. They just need to know, what does this mean for me? And so the more answers you have to give them, the more control they feel. The more in control the people around them are with those kinds of changes, the better they feel. And the more consistent parents are, if they're going two different directions. So at dad's house, it's not wildly different from what the expectations are at mom's house, the better they tend to do. And also, of course, if we're not tearing each other down, that's also important. But when it's grief, when it's loss, a loved one, when somebody's died, I mean, probably the biggest, the first loss that a lot of our kids have is the death of a pet. I love children's books. I think they're wonderful for introducing topics and letting them learn about things through somebody else's lens. It's a little less scary when you're reading about it. But I think the more, like, if you're anticipating it, the more you can kind of scaffold some things and help them and prep them, the better. When it's unanticipated and something's just happened, I think we get into the mode of just being willing to meet them where they are when they need it. Kids also process death and grief very differently than adults do. So they may just need the facts, and they may run off and play and be fine for a while, and then may come back a little bit later and ask another question that, like, out of the blue, that kind of knocks us off, like, whoa. And sometimes people worry that they're processing or anxious about something, and I would defer back to, really if they're doing fine most of the time, and it's not an ongoing intensity or frequency, they probably are just processing it like kids process things. But I do think being willing in the middle of carpool line when that question pops up, to answer it and be present in that moment is the best way to kind of support them. Just a lot of empathy, a lot of understanding. But bottom line, empowerment, like I said earlier, is your number one thing that we're trying to teach as parents, and we want our kids to be resilient. That doesn't mean they're never gonna have a bump or a bruise or a loss or, something go wrong. In fact, they're gonna be better for it if they learn how to cope and manage through it.
Just to piggyback on that, and I'm not really saying anything new that Andrea hasn't said before, but I think sometimes it's easy to struggle with how much do I share with my child when there is a loss or a big change or something like that. And you can keep it developmentally appropriate. You don't have to share all the nitty-gritty details, but they do need information. So having the conversation, talking to them about it, letting them ask their questions, I think is so important. So just don't avoid those conversations.
One of the things we say in preschool and early learning is answer the question that the child is asking, and maybe just stop there. You don't have to go more, because if they're asking the question, they're wanting to know something, and they'll find it somewhere. Maybe they'll ask a friend or they'll ask someone else. So, that's a good rule of thumb. If they're not asking for more, maybe that's a sign that they're not ready for that.
Well, and they stop listening. So it's that fine balance of figuring out, like, how much do I want to share? How much do I want to talk? We tend as parents to talk more than we think we're talking, and they've stopped listening. It is going. So it is, figuring out that magical balance of, have I listened enough? Have I shared enough? And have I also imparted to them that we believe that you can solve this problem or sit with this thing that's uncomfortable or yucky, right? Because if we swoop in there and try to fix it all, and let's go get ice cream and let's do this, although that might be a good thing in the moment, but just letting them sit with stuff is important, because you're giving them the message that they're tough enough to handle it and figure it out.
That's so true. And you're teaching them that their feelings are okay. We don't need to try to avoid uncomfortable feelings because they come up throughout our life. So acknowledging, yep, this is hard, and sitting with that, and then again teaching them, this is one other topic, but teaching them through modeling, what do we do when we are having a hard time? Like, what are some positive coping strategies? And what is your kid interested in? What do they enjoy? Do they enjoy music? Do they enjoy being outside? But helping from a young age, helping them develop those really positive coping strategies to manage these hard moments.
We've got about 10 minutes left, so I want to open it up to questions. But as I'm listening to all this goodness from you guys and your expertise, one of the scaffoldings, and we talk about this in preschool too, but the scaffoldings for all of this communication is identifying what your parenting style is. I think, Janet or Andrea, you said, there's a lot of work that's been done out there about the authoritative, the democratic, the permissive parenting style. Just a side note, I see Miss Allen, my colleague and friend, standing at the back of the room. But one of the things that we've been talking about, just because we have teenagers, is why don't our kids want to drive? It's just so weird. When I was 16, I could not wait to get my license, and this all relates. I think it's because we've been helicopter parents. I think we don't tell them that they can't drive, so they don't want to, and it's easy. But it's just weird. If you have kids that age, why don't they want to drive?
If you haven't heard of this book, iGen, like iPad, iGen, generation, Jean Twiney is a researcher, and she's a generational researcher, and I really recommend this book to you because no one in this room, I'm pretty sure, grew up online, okay? and they have. That's why it's called I generation. And they are a very different generation because of it, and she addresses that about the driving. Like, why aren't they driving? And part of it is because we are all about safety. Oh my God, and driving's scary, and driving is scary. And so, anyway.
But it goes all the way back to like when they're tiny people, right? And what has this helicopter parenting done as we look at kids getting older? And so identifying our parenting style is going to lead to all that communication and the goodness that you're talking about. You want to say something?
Yeah, I'm just itching because about the time, I think our world changed in 9/11, and that was about the time, at least my cohort of parents had babies. And I can see that from then on, like how people before us parented and how parenting has been affected since that time. Our world has changed, and even the way we want to hold on tighter and be more careful and be more protective. I mean, I think a lot has changed in the messaging accidentally sometimes too. It's just sort of happened that we are more overprotective at times too.
Okay. Questions. What I'm going to do is if you have a question, just raise your hand, shout it out, and I would like to, okay, go ahead.
Hey, I'm Blair. So, how do you make sure that if you have a child who is just seemingly being happy-go-lucky, always pats the kid on the back that falls and says, "Come get up, I got you, buddy," is invited to every play that, like, that child, and you also have another child that maybe exhibits more need and stress and anxiety. How do you make sure that the one that's sort of like, "I'm good," also feels like seen? You know what I'm saying? Without looking for like something wrong.
So for those of you who didn't hear, balancing different personalities with children in the same family unit. Is that what you're, and making sure they have their needs met?
I mean, I think that, again, that's one of those $1,000,000 questions, because you're always, as parents, I think when you have multiple children, trying to figure out one, you can't meet all their needs the same way, because ironically, they're all very different. I mean, they just are wired differently, they come out with temperaments that, and I think all of us, in the roles that we have had, could say that at some time or another, a child has shared with us a frustration that their parents are ultra focused on the other child for whatever reason, if something's going on. And I think, it's really important to keep that in your head and kind of find ways to support that other child and make sure that there's an open line of communication for that one who's doing well, so that they know that, even though they're doing well, they're going to hit bumps in the road too, and that you are still the person that is the trusted adult they could come to, right?
And adding to that, I think, we are all so busy, our kids are busy, we are busy, but to the extent that you're able to, I mean, we're talking about modeling with social media, carve out, it doesn't have to be a lot, it can be literally 10 minutes, 5-10 minutes, where you are just giving your child kind of one-on-one individual time. That could just be, it could be right before bed, it could be, taking them for a quick walk, cooking dinner together, any of that stuff, just where you're finding an opportunity to connect with each of your children as individuals.
That's great. Another question out there. Anybody? Oh, you guys must have done a good job.
I don't want to bug our last question. You all mentioned how blessed we are to be in a city where we have so many resources. And I think that there is also a contradiction to that in a sense. How as parents do we find the right solutions when there are so many solutions out there?
That's a fabulous question, and I think, so I have told parents over the years, because you'll find that you get into your Amazon cart and start clicking all these parenting books on something when your kid starts demonstrating those things, and you really have to, you can make yourself feel more anxious by too much information, right? So finding that balance of, you might not read every chapter in that book, you might just find the chapter that really pertains to something that's going on with you at the time.
Like Google MD. Like I can diagnose myself because of Google, right?
Go down a rabbit hole, and then at the end you're like, well, I don't really feel any better yet. I haven't really gotten to what, and I think the same is true in right now, in the fall, I'm dealing with a lot of seniors and senior angst around going to college, and I say to parents, please don't go to social events and start doing the comparison thing. And
getting all the, because you get too much information that's not helpful. You might stick to 2 or 3 of your kind of trusted friends who parent similarly to you, that are the ones you bounce ideas off of. You might also, again, look at things that, you know, if you go the Google route, make sure that you're looking at something that's a large study that's been looked at a lot, right?
And I was going to say, in terms of community resources, depending on what the specific struggle that you're noticing with your child is, for example, if it's mental health or anxiety or something like that, we've talked a lot about partnering with your schools. Like, school counselors are a great first stop for some of these resources. They can recommend good psychologists for the psychoeducational evaluations. They typically have a list of mental health providers. Like, I know I personally partner with a lot of school counselors. And so they'll be able to say, oh, hey, your child is struggling with anxiety. Here are, you know, 5 therapists in the Atlanta area that we have relationships with that we know to be good providers. And pediatricians often have kind of the same lists. So just making sure, or word of mouth, if you've got a friend who has a child who struggled with something and they've been open and shared that and they've gone to a good provider who they've seen success with, like, that's a really wonderful way to make sure that you're in the right hands. But I always tell parents, and this is from like a mental health perspective, or even my adult clients, I'll tell them, you know, a good therapeutic experience is all about finding the right fit. And so if I'm not that for you, I'm going to make sure I get you to the right person. And so you just, you know, give it a couple of sessions. If it feels like it's working and your child is connecting with them, or if you are, as an adult, are going to see somebody to get support for something going on in your family, or support to help in your parenting.
As we close up, Janet wanted to say one quick thing.
I just want to address the elephant in the room. Where is this room that we're in right now? You're in a church. And that is this, probably, in my opinion, as the oldest person on this panel, that looking back, my daughter's 31, I'm going to be a grandmother, I'm just saying, that's the single best thing I ever did for my child, was bring her to church every single Sunday, because when you know whose you are, that's very grounding. And we all play by God's rules. So, and one lamb, Diane, and I don't know what you're pointing at.
Miami Dale. So One Lamb, if you information about the One Lamb initiative is on your chairs, and also please, there's a feedback form that we would like you to fill out. If you liked this event, if you want more like it, if there's topics that we can go deeper on, maybe even one topic or two, we'd be